Okay, pretty much got everyone now, I think. So welcome everyone. I think I've met quite a few of you before. I'm recognising faces now from some of the other webinars that we've run in this Growing Good series. But if we haven't met before, my name is Amy. And I'd like to welcome you this morning to this Church Urban Fund webinar, which is called Recruiting, Managing and Retaining Good Volunteers. So hopefully you're finding yourselves in the right place. And we're really happy to have you here with us this morning. So before we get started, a bit of housekeeping for us. This session is being recorded, but please note that your faces won't be visible on the recording, and we'll send you a copy of the recording afterwards, and we'll pop it on our website as well, so you can direct people there who aren't able to be at the meeting this morning. You should be able to see a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. For me, it's at the bottom, but if you're on a tablet or a phone, it might be at the top or somewhere else. That's the Q&A button, and you can pop questions in there as we go along. If you can't find it, don't worry, you could use the chat instead, or when we have our question points, you can just unmute yourself and ask it verbally if you can't find anywhere to type your question. And we'll have lots of opportunities for questions throughout the session. I think we've got 3 check-in points for questions. So thank you for joining us. We hope this is going to be a really insightful, helpful session for you as you think about how you work with volunteers. So this webinar, as I said, is the final one in a series of 5 that we've been running for churches. They've all been designed to help equip and inspire you as you engage with your communities and do the incredible work that you're doing. And each of these webinars is linked to one of our Growing Good themes. Now, Growing Good is Church Urban Fund's free 6-session course, helping churches explore the connections between social action, discipleship and growth. And today we're linking to the theme of participation, which is one of the 5 that we explore in the course. And we'll hear a bit more about the Growing Good course at the end of our session today from Polly. But for now, for today's session, it's time to introduce you to our host today, Julia Hill. So Julia is Head of Deanery and Parish Support and is also Acting Head of Mission Support and Ministry Development at Bath and Wells Diocese. She is a fountain of knowledge of all things volunteering, and indeed she wrote Church Urban Fund's volunteering resources when she was part of the team here some years ago. So I'm delighted that she's here to speak with us today. Thank you so much, Julia, and I will hand over to you.
It is really lovely to be here. So we've got the next slide is a lovely picture of smiling volunteers. I'm assuming they're smiling volunteers. Amy might have said that with a colleague from Church Urban Fund and Church of England, I worked on these resources a number of years ago. What you can expect from the session today is we're going to look at 4 sections around discernment, support, development, practicalities. I'll say a bit more about that. They won't make sense at this. But as Amy has said, there's a chance to ask questions at different points. And there are links when you get the slides, there are links to the resources and to templates. So don't worry about taking loads of notes. It won't help you. Just wait until you get the slides and think about some questions. And I just want to acknowledge that, you know, I've got some experience, obviously, in working with volunteers, but actually there'll be loads of experience in the room and you probably can answer each other's questions. So there is no sense that there is, you know, one expert. I'm sure we'll bring different stuff. So we're going to look at the distinctiveness of volunteering in church context, some building blocks for working well with volunteers, some stuff around finding and matching volunteers with roles, supporting volunteers, including during difficulties. Church sometimes finds it hard to name that. I think it's really important to do so. And also managing formalities, which can seem tedious, but is actually really, really essential, like the formality of me actually being in the room. That's quite a useful one. So just to give a bit of context, when I first started working with volunteers, it wasn't in a church context. It was actually in a museum context, which some people think is like churches. But it was quite interesting as somebody of faith and who does a lot of work with churches generally, to think about how can you translate good practice from a secular context into a church context? Can you simply transpose the whole lot, or actually are there any distinctive things? And I think it is useful if you're working in a church context to think about that difference. So here we have the standard journey for working with volunteers. So an organisation with things to do, identifies roles that it wants volunteers to take on, advertises for volunteers, you have a selection process, an induction process. This is the ideal journey, not happens everywhere. Ongoing support and development, and then the volunteer continues in the role, shifts to different roles, or moves on. Relatively straightforward, still needs a lot of managing and has a lot of complexity, but it's neater than sometimes what you get in a church context. And that's for a variety of reasons. So in a church context, you are often drawing volunteers from existing members. Now, on one level, that can be great if you've got a pool of people, but it also has complexities. The language of volunteering may be alien. In fact, if you talk about people as volunteers, they may get really cross. And so you have to be aware of that difference in language. Sometimes churches want to talk about discipleship or how they're living out their faith. So the language thing is one to find the right language for your context and not be hung up on it. Essentially, a volunteer is just somebody who does something worthwhile without being paid. And sometimes you just need to say that to people. Not denying your discipleship, I'm just saying this is a role, it isn't paid. There is often, and this is a really key one, not the tidy start and finish points that you get in a more secular organisation. So sometimes the role starts not because there's a role to do, but because there's a person with a gift. And they're saying, oh, I'd really like to do this, or I feel I've got a gift to this, or I feel God is calling me to do this. And then it's not about starting with a tidy role and enabling them. It's about starting with the person and then enabling them. So that's often not as tidy. The other real killer, actually, if I'm being honest, is that in a church context, if things go wrong with a volunteer role in the secular context, normally it means that the volunteer leaves the organisation, which may be difficult and painful and all of those things. But in a church context, if something goes wrong, often the person is still a member of your church or your organisation, even after that they've stopped in a role. And therefore, how you manage that transition is really important, and you need to be aware of that. And then another thing, there's the blurring the boundaries between volunteer participant, and this really speaks into the growing good stuff. You have a participant who comes along to something like, it might be a food bank, or it might be a drop-in or cafe or something. Actually, they might gradually transition into being a volunteer. And that's a great bit of blurring and a generosity, I think. The other distinctiveness is you've got prayer to draw on. So when you really don't feel you can do it, then you in a church context, you've got prayer. And another thing I think is worth saying is about forgiveness. Forgiveness should be part of a church's DNA. You will get it wrong, so will other people. Forgiveness is a really good distinctiveness about volunteering in the church context. So that's the thing. So the big picture, I'm going to talk a lot today about principles, because how you make something work in a context will depend on your context, and every context is different. But if you know the principles, then it makes life easier to get things right. So person, a volunteer, there's a role that they want to do or you want them to do. And then there's the organisation, which in this context is a church or church organisation. The sweet spot is blindingly obvious, isn't it? It works best when you have the right person in the right role who's a good match for what you're doing as an organisation, as a church. So that is what you're aiming for. The question is, how do you do it? So the building blocks to a good volunteer experience, I think, are a mixture of discernment, support, development, and practicalities. And during today, this time, we're going to think about how to get those building blocks in place in ways that work for you and for the people who are volunteering. And I just want to say this caveat, I cannot say this too many times. They are the key areas to consider, but things have to fit context. You are so often you're rarely starting with a blank sheet. And you have to be allowed to decide on what the priorities are for you as a church or an organisation and what your capacity is. Sometimes you just have to say, in the perfect world, I'd do this. We don't have the capacity for that, so we're going to do it slightly differently. So always give yourself permission to think what is actually going to work in practice and be sustainable. Because if you can be happy in the way you're working with volunteers and it is sustainable, you're more likely to thrive. And if you're more likely to thrive, they're more likely to thrive. So it always has to fit the context. So discernment. So I look back at these slides from a while back and thought, oh, there's a lot of stuff on that. But I think it is worth saying that sometimes we think discernment in this context might just be about saying, shall we discern if this is the right role for you? And that is obviously important. But it is also important to say, how do we discern what we as a church or as an organisation are doing? How do we discern what we do as part of that individually? How do we discern what we do collectively? How do we discern for the short term and for the long term? So discernment, I want to just really say, it's not just an individual thing, it's a collective thing. And it's not just at the beginning of something, it's an ongoing thing. So it's as important for people to discern when it's right to stop a role as it is important for them to discern when it's right to start. So discernment, oh, that got bigger. So for example, have you discerned what the organization's purpose and values is? If you haven't got a sense as a church or an organization what your actual purpose and values are, it will be really hard to attract people into participating in that. So that bit of discernment is really, really important, and it's quite easy to overlook. There's the discernment about the match between the person and the organization or church. So, and that's about how you do things is as important as what you do. So if somebody comes to join in with what you're doing, but there's a complete mismatch of values, then the chances are things will go wrong. So being attentive to whether there's a good match is important. And it doesn't mean that they have to get it all up front. It just means there has to be a willingness to work within the values of how you operate. In terms of the role, discernment about what the role does or could involve. And I'd really encourage you to be imaginative about that. So sometimes you might have a role that you want to do, and you know what the role is, and then somebody comes along who can't quite do all of it, and the temptation is to say, oh, it's a real shame you can't do all of it. But actually, if you looked at the role and you said, oh, well, actually, could we do it differently? Because that person wants to do that bit, and we might find somebody to do that bit. So sometimes we package up roles, and we're reluctant to split them down, but actually sometimes, that's what needs to happen. So it's about being not just what the role does, but what it could involve. And then there's whether there's a match between the person and the role. And again, it doesn't need to be that they're the complete article now, but do they have the capacity to grow into this role? Will it enable them to flourish? Do they have the core skills, or do they have at least an aptitude to learn to do it? So that's discernment. So that's fine to say that, but what might you do? Well, in the real world, sometimes you start with the person. So in a church context, you would always hope to start with the person, and that there is a person gifted by God, the gifts they have and the gifts they are to you as a collective. What is it that they might be called to do? And then you talk to them, and you start with the person. What is the role or task that they feel a sense of calling to? And that would be great. Realistically, sometimes in an organizational church, there is a role or task, and it's like, well, we need somebody to do it. That is just the reality. And I think it's important to remember that sometimes people do have a strong sense of calling that asks them to want to take something on. But sometimes actually what it is there's something that needs doing, and somebody who hadn't imagined doing it agrees to do it and can grow through taking it on. So it's important to be prepared to do both. Sometimes starting with the role, sometimes starting with the person, but whichever you're starting with, honestly, clarity is so important. We sometimes embark on asking somebody to get involved or enabling them to get involved, and are never quite clear about what it is they're getting involved with. So the question is, if they're going to take on something, however, whether it's making a coffee as part of a church service or an event, what is clarity? Why are you asking them to do it? Why does it matter? How do they do it? What are the practicalities? And what actually is it they're being asked to do? So, for example, I was asked to do coffee after church years and years ago. Nobody ever told me whether I needed to bring milk. It's those sorts of things can really trip you up. How might you find more information on this? Well, if you go and when you get the slides, you'll be able to click through, and there's a section on clarifying tasks and roles on page 33. There's a checklist to help it with you. And then there's some different ways. In a formal setting, you might want to give a role description. In a more informal way, you might just have a conversation, or you might give a nice little card that says, thank you for taking this on, and you might pray for people at the start of the role if that felt appropriate in your context. But it is absolutely vital to clarify what you're asking and enabling somebody to do and how they will be supported. Because when things go wrong, and they always do go wrong, even in a small way, if you've been clear at the beginning, it's much easier to go back to that. So that's clarifying. Right. So, $6 million question. You've got something that needs doing. How on earth do you get people? We think all those hands are going up, but sometimes we all know they don't go up. What I have found really, really useful is this thing that I believe comes from marketing, which is awareness, interest, desire, action. If you're an operatic person, I'm not, you might think it's AIDA. So it's really worth being attentive to all these stages. If nobody is aware of what you're doing, this is back to the participation stuff. If nobody's aware of what you're doing, there's no way they're going to volunteer because they don't know what's happening and they don't know why it's important. So you want people to be aware before you can ever expect them to join in. You've got to find a way of piquing their interest. It's no good saying we need a volunteer. That is the most dreary thing. You've got to find a way of how can you connect an awareness of what you're doing to people being interested, translate that into a desire to get involved. And then this is the other. So I think the two things that most often we get wrong are the awareness and action ends. So we forget to make people aware of what we're doing. And then the other end, we might make them aware, get them interested, but have failed to make it really, really easy to take action to get involved. So if somebody is interested, how do they take action? Who do they have to speak to? Is it easy for them to find that person? Are the methodologies of getting in touch with them going to match what they're able to do? It's no good asking somebody to go on a website if they haven't got an internet connection. So, be really savvy if you want to get people involved about making it really easy for them to make that connection, and a really low level barriers to asking. So if don't ask them to get in touch with the scariest person because they're never going to do it. So just make it really, really easy for them to take action. So I find that a really, really helpful guide to recruiting. And a bit more information on that, you can again follow up, clarifying the role, which is on the earlier slide, some stuff on taking on volunteers with additional support needs, which I would really encourage you. I'm sure everybody in this room would say the same. Some ideas about sources of volunteers, not always just going to the normal places, checklists for taking on volunteers, some guidance from the government about age, benefits of criminal records, and then some guidance on interviews. There's loads of information out there, and this will take you through, so that hopefully is helpful. Okay, right. Any questions so far? Amy?
We haven't had any in the chat.
Okay.
If anyone has any right now, type away.
There'll be other chances as well. So don't feel you've got to rake up a question that you're not interested in really asking.
No.
No. Great. I shall press on. Okay. So let's imagine that you heaved a huge sigh of relief because somebody has either volunteered to do something that you'd never imagined they might do and it's going to be fantastic, or somebody's volunteered to do something you really needed them to do. So we've done a little bit on discernment. The question is, how do you offer support? Who will offer support and guidance? And I've put this deliberately, including resolving difficulties. My experience is when you clarify at the beginning of somebody volunteering that they're going to take something on and how they're going to be supported, it's really helpful to say up front, at some point in this experience, something will go wrong. Either we'll get something wrong and you'll be cross with us or confused, or you'll do something that wasn't quite what we expected and somebody will ask you a question about it. It is really, really helpful to say that, because then if you have to address it later, it's not some huge thing dropping out of the sky. It's like, oh yeah, we said things would go wrong. It's gone wrong. What are we going to do about it? So it normalizes the fact that actually things don't always run smoothly. So I think that's a really key element of support. So support, what does support look like? Guidance on the role. I mean, not expecting somebody to be a mind reader and knowing how to do it. You know, what are they actually being asked to do? Can they have some guidance on it? Otherwise, you'll only get people who can already do everything, and that's hopeless for diversity. So you've got to be able to offer guidance on the role, and it's got to match the person. Guidance on practicalities, back to Julia, do you bring the milk? You know, it may sound like a trivial thing, but actually it's the sort of thing that really undermines people's confidence. Where's the loo? You know, are they allowed to make themselves a drink? Those things really, really matter. So the guidance on the role, but also the guidance on the accompanying practicalities. Can they claim expenses? How do they claim expenses? A sense of personal connection really matters to people. We are, after all, you know, relationship people. So what sort of personal connection people want will vary, because people vary, but some opportunity for personal connection is important. Troubleshooting, catch stuff before it becomes intractable, and valuing people. And I cannot stress too much on valuing people. I don't know whether you've experienced this, but I definitely have, that you've bust a gut to do something and somebody says, thank you so much for doing that, it was wonderful. And you think, well, what about it was wonderful? Could you be a bit more specific? Because then I will know not just that you're doing the tick box thanking me thing, but you said, oh, Julia, you know, I noticed that the way you spoke to that person was really supportive. Thank you so much. You're doing a great job. Tiny difference, but makes a massive difference. Volunteers aren't paid. They're often much less confident than they might appear. You know, be specific when you value them, and find ways of valuing them that matter to them. For some people, it will be, you know, making them a drink, or, you know, getting them some lunch, or feeding them occasionally. You know, whatever it is, just make sure that people feel personally valued. So all of those things really matter. And if you want to see some more guidance on building relationships, if you go following the link to page 15, that will give you some more guidance. Resolving difficulties is one element of good support, and honestly deal with stuff before they become really, really shockingly difficult. Why do you need to resolve difficulties? Well, you need to resolve difficulties will arise not because people are hopeless, but because they're human. You know, we are all human. We will all get things wrong or misunderstand stuff. So just normalize it. It's not because you're hopeless, it's because you're human. So issues will arise. Culture is key as to how do you deal with stuff. Keep the purpose central. So if it's something around, I don't know, offering hospitality, if the purpose of what you're doing is to offer hospitality, then how that's done in order for people to feel loved and supported really matters. So if somebody's being really cross in that situation, it's not about the fact that they're being cross per se. It's the fact that, you know, here we try to make people feel welcomed and valued and included. And, you know, I just noticed that you were a bit cross, and that probably didn't help it. So always take it back to the purpose and the values, and try to avoid, you know, being overly, don't crush people, basically. If the value of your organisation is to make people feel loved and valued, it's no good crushing your volunteers, but equally it's no good leaving them to do stuff in a way that causes mayhem. And clarity, as I've said at the beginning, helps. So there's some more guidance on tackling difficulties, page 37, and some specific suggestions. And there's a problem-solving template. Really important when you're working with volunteers that you do not simply replicate paid employee stuff, because it makes it look as if you're entering into a contractual relationship with a volunteer, which is both legally difficult and morally difficult. So have separate policies and procedures for volunteers. That's a really important thing to do. But all of that's there, and it's a template. You adapt it, you make it work for your context. Development, another element of support. Volunteering can be a source of growth, but, you know, but people are all different, aren't they? So development will look different for different people. Some people take on a role because they want it to build their CV, or they want a new challenge, or they think it'll help with confidence. Some people, frankly, just are a bit bored and they want to get something done. You know, people may start with one motivation, and it might change over time. So and understanding the motivation of a volunteer will help you work well with them. So, but don't expect them to be exactly the same person they were at the beginning and feel offended if they've changed. So, you know, be attentive to changes, and remember that, you know, not only does the volunteering help the church or organisation to develop, but it also shapes the organisational church. So It's really important. And I think one of the really key questions for anybody involved in church volunteering is, in this role, in this environment, are we giving opportunities to people to develop their relationship with God, to grow in faith? And if not, is that a problem? I mean, I suppose my answer would be yes. So I think the question is, what opportunities are you giving? So lots more on encouraging development and more guidance if you follow the link when you get the slides. Any questions?
We do have a question.
Oh, yeah.
And it is, please, could you comment on the common approach of minimising what a job involves when telling someone one is trying to persuade to take on a role, both pros and cons?
Yeah, so I think honesty is the guiding principle, isn't it? So if I say to somebody, not much is involved, and then they start the role and they discover that actually an enormous amount is involved, then you've got a loss of trust as your foundation of your relationship, and that is not good. So if you feel tempted to minimize what's involved, then I think the question I would be asking myself is, am I asking too much? And instead of minimizing it by pretending it's less, could I actually shape this role slightly differently and make it more manageable? So I'll give a concrete example, which may or may not work, but I hopefully will. So church wardens in a church context, that is a famous role that grows absolutely exponentially. When we do training in our diocese, I'm in Bath and Wells, for church wardens, what we try and say over and over again is, you do not have to do this all on your own. These are the responsibilities of this role, but you can share them out. You need to make sure they happen, but don't try and do it all yourself. And actually, by sharing it, it can be life-giving for you and for other people. So I think it's really important to be honest. I think there is a bit of minimization that is helpful, which is to say, this is the role, this is the amount of time I think it will take, this is the length of time we'd like you to try and do it for. But don't panic. You're not expected to be able to do everything right from the beginning. We'll see how it goes and we'll review it. And when there are things that you don't know how to do, we'll pick them up and we'll make sure that somebody helps you to do it. So that sort of minimization, which is, you don't have to be the done deal right from the beginning, we'll support you and then help you. I think that sort of minimization is helpful. I think lying to somebody to pretend it's not going to take them 5 days a week when it's going to take them 6, that's not good, because it will bite you later. And actually that's effectively a lack of clarity, because you've made the real expectation unclear right from the start, and it's never going to end well. So if you're tempted to do that, think what it is about the role that needs to change in order to make you not to have to do that slight assembly. Does that help? I don't know who asked the question, but
yeah, they said very helpful answer. Thank you.
Great. Okay, anything else?
Not for now, no.
No, I'm going to career on then. So practicalities. I am a fan of practicalities. Sometimes people say that the practicalities are the boring stuff, but in my experience, the practicalities are often the things that make a real difference to whether or not people flourish. So dealing with the small print without losing the plot is the summary of that. There are a lot of formalities, and it is easy to look at that slide and think, oh my goodness, that is absolutely overpowering. If only we didn't have to do all that. But I want to encourage you to embrace it, because if you get these formalities and practicalities right, it will really, really help you. And a little bit of work up front will save you a lot of hassle later. And I'd also encourage you to reframe. And if you go to the section on this, on managing formalities, one example here is on health and safety. Now, health and safety is one of those ones where people groan madly and say, if it wasn't for health and safety, we'd be able to do lots of stuff. And there may be an element of truth in that. But when you go to this section, what it will help you see is actually we're attentive to health and safety for 3 reasons. It's morally right, because actually we do care whether people are healthy and safe. It's legally necessary, and it's practically important. And if you work with that slight reframing, instead of getting into that loop of saying, oh, this is really terrible, we've got to do it, you can embrace it as something positive. And that, I think, is very important for your culture. And then if you go to those sections, as well as the what, health and safety, the why, morally, legally, practically important, there's also how might you do this to find it easier to do. And again, there's this guidance, but there's loads of guidance out there. And you know, the great thing about the Together Network and Church Open Fund is there's a lot of learning across different contexts. So there's loads of signposting that can happen. So you do need to do this stuff. Try to embrace it positively, because all of these things have a positive root. So I think I'm coming up the home straight, my goodness. And on time, Amy, I'd like you to notice that. Okay, so what does a good experience look like? Well, you have a volunteer, an existing volunteer, or a potential volunteer. You have an organisation, which may be a church, or it may be a sort of parachurch organisation, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But that's the context within which they have to flourish, and it's really important. It's like a child in a family. That is the context in which they need to flourish. So you've got to be upfront about that. Your church or organisation will have its own values. I hope that love will be one of them. Service may be, inclusion may be. These are just some I've picked, and respect. If those are the values of your church family, your organisation, whatever it is, those are the values that will inform how you interact with your volunteer. So when you have these building blocks of discernment, support, development, and practicalities, they all filter through those values. So how you tackle the practicalities, for example, has to be done in the light of respect, love, service, and inclusion, or whatever your values are. And the same is true for all of the others. And I think it's really important to notice that those arrows go two-way, because the volunteers, if you get this right, the volunteers, their influence will influence how you operate and influence how you tackle those discernment, support, development, practicalities for the future. So these are not solid lines for a good reason. If the volunteers in an organisation really, really transform, hopefully for good, if you get it right. And quick example from a secular context, I worked in an organisation which made a practical decision that it needed to involve volunteers and asked me to set some stuff up for it, which I did. At the beginning, the paid staff were deeply sceptical and resistant, but we gradually introduced volunteers in a very clear way. And a few years later, I can't remember, 5 years later perhaps, one of the paid staff said, we were really, really sceptical about this, but actually we love having volunteers. It has transformed us. And it's partly because if you're doing it well, when somebody does something voluntarily, genuinely voluntarily, they're there doing it because they want to do it and they think it matters, because they're not there because they're paid or their pension or something depends on it. So to have people involved simply for the love of what they're doing is a transformative thing for any church or organisation. And it's a great thing. Managing volunteers takes high levels of skill, but it is utterly worthwhile and transformative for an organisation and for the person who's involved. That is last questions from this section, but there's loads of guidance. You know, this is a very, very quick overview really to signpost you to some principles and the other guidance. Amy, any other questions?
No, I can't see any. Does anyone have any burning questions now? No, that's
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to ask, in my particular church, there's been a massive shift over the last 20 years or so from everything being done by volunteers to taking on staff and everything kind of revolving around them. Do you think there's any hope of that changing, being reversed? Is it just reflecting how things are in society and the availability of people? Or, you know, is it a good or bad thing?
So I'm going to sound very Anglican here when I say it's probably neither good nor bad. It depends on the context. I mean, I once did a project with 3 organisations. It was museums at that time, and some were completely volunteer run, some were mixture, and some were heavily weighted to paid staff. It can be an immense advantage to have paid staff because they have capacity and predictability. And if the paid staff are committed to involving and engaging others, then that predictability and capacity can be transformative. If the paid staff think that their role is to protect the territory and stop other people from interfering, then I would say that is undoubtedly not a great way of getting participation levels to rise. So I think it depends on the paid staff's understanding of their role. If their role is to nurture and support and encourage and release the calling and the gifts of those people around, and to support them in these very, definite ways, it can be absolutely fantastic. But there's always a danger, there can be a danger when you appoint somebody that they then feel that they have to do it all themselves because they're paid. And it can actually become a control thing, but it can also become a guilt thing. So I think what I would do in that situation is I would want to look at the role descriptions, the job descriptions of the paid staff, and see whether or not releasing the gifts and supporting the participation in the engagement of other people is seen as core to their role. And if it isn't, I suppose I'd be asking why. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Amy.
Great. I don't think we have any more questions. So I think we can move on, and we're right on time. Thank you, Julia.
Amazing.
Okay. Yes. So now Jessica, who leads on a project called Wayfinder, run by Church Urban Fund, is going to talk to us for a few minutes. So Wayfinder is a fantastic example of a project utilising volunteers really well. So Jessica is kindly going to talk to us a little bit about the programme, how it works, and some of the lessons that they've learned on working with volunteers from it. I've very cruelly only allowed 10 minutes for this. We could easily spend a whole session talking about what they've learned and how it works. But thank you, Jessica, and I'll hand over to you now. Julia is going to move the slides for you. I'm just going to answer this question about where the guidance is that Julia's been referring to. So it's on our website. I'll just pop this in the chat now. So these are all the volunteering resources that Julia's been referring to. They're all available on our website. If you've got any questions about them, please do email us. We'll also send them round in an email to you with the recording afterwards. And we're actually in the process of slightly refreshing these resources, making sure they're completely up to date with all the standards, especially safeguarding advice and things like that. And we will share those with you when they're completely up to date via email as well.
So thank you for the introduction, Amy, and for speaking so positively about Wayfinder. It was interesting to hear you to such a nice introduction, because the project I run, Wayfinder, which I'll tell you a little bit more about now, is around a year old, and I think it is going very well at the moment. And what our volunteers are currently achieving is fantastic, but that certainly wasn't the case for quite a while. And so I think here we're going to talk about the difficulties we faced, but particularly about the difficulties we faced introducing a volunteer program in the current context. So as Amy said, my name is Jessica Walker and I run Wayfinder, which is a volunteer homelessness befriending project. I've got a lot of history in running volunteer projects. It's what I've done for most of my career. And for us, we're finding now is a time post-COVID unlike any other before. So Wayfinder is based, we have teams of volunteers in Leicester, Nottingham and Manchester. And the aim of the programme, and so the aim of the volunteers in each area, is to support people with experience of homelessness to remain housed. It is hosted by our Together Network partners in Nottingham and Manchester, and a Christian homelessness service delivery organisation in Leicester. If any of you are based in Leicester, the partner there are called The Bridge and are fantastic. So within Wayfinder, the aim of the volunteer role is to create long-term befriending and mentoring relationships. So we work solely with people who have been homeless but are now housed, so have their own tendencies. And the aim is about stopping repeat homelessness, because very often people who are homeless and get somewhere to live, they lose the tenancy because they don't know how to maintain a tenancy, what you need to do. They really struggle with the responsibility, with what is asked of them. And it's, as anyone who has volunteered or worked in the area will know, unfortunately, homelessness is very cyclical. So the volunteers work one-on-one with a participant. It's a long-term volunteering role. They volunteer would be matched with someone between 6 months and 2 years, although 6 months is just the what we ask of people. They can go longer if you like, and they provide both practical and social support. And the way I like to describe it is, if you're someone who is fortunate enough to have had a supportive family member or supportive friends, you will have someone to go to if you're living by yourself and something's gone wrong, or you don't know how to do something like registering with a GP, how to pay your bills, how to sort out issues with your landlord. But they're also a friend and someone who keeps you feeling positive and moving forward. So it's filling that gap for people who don't have someone available to be both practical and social support. Volunteers meet with their participants in the community. So you're thinking of coffee shops, sometimes even within local churches, church halls. They don't meet in the participant homes, and that's something we'll talk about a bit. I'll talk about a bit later in terms of safeguarding, to provide that support as is needed. So I mentioned when I started that this has been an incredibly difficult time for us to recruit volunteers. So the programme started around a year ago. It didn't actually start at the same time in each of the 3 cities. And so the two of the participants in particular in Manchester and Leicester had a long history of working with volunteers and had a lot of volunteers for the other projects they were, or had a lot of volunteers for the other projects they had run, which included night shelters, food banks, soup kitchens, things along those lines. What we found, and this is what this quote here referenced, was a lot of people who were long-term volunteers during COVID didn't go back to it. One of our partners, the Bridge in Leicester, mentioned that they lost 90% of their volunteers during COVID, and a lot of these had been very, very long-term volunteers. And when the model for this program was being put together by the organizations pre-COVID, what we had hoped was that a lot of these long-term volunteers maybe would move to this for a different opportunity, to try something else, because what these partners had found was that the long-term volunteers did jump between opportunities in the organization, but because a lot of people moved on and they didn't manage to bring them back in, we were starting completely afresh, which was a challenge. The second difficulty in recruiting volunteers, and this was something that we were aware of going into this when the program was put together, and something that has been touched on previously by Julia, was that this was not an easy role. So providing one-on-one support to people who might have complex needs, poor mental health, and almost no other support is quite emotionally taxing. And I think in particular, a lot of other roles working around homelessness are food bank or night shelter. They're certainly difficult in their own way, but they're not about building relationships, and they're not necessarily about supporting people to resolve the challenges they're facing. And I think what that means is this isn't a role that anyone who wants to work in homelessness feels able to do, completely understandably. So in order to overcome the challenges around recruitment, there are a few different things we had to do. So as I said previously, we struggled with our traditional recruitment approaches, which were looking at our an inside pool of volunteers, but also we had a lot of churches we worked with within these areas. But this became a point where many of the church partners were struggling to fill their own volunteer needs, understandably, and so couldn't spare people for programs like this. What has actually worked very well was to create the pool of fantastic volunteers we had now, was to look into these formal places for people who were actively looking for volunteer roles. So every area in which we're based, and I think most cities in the country certainly have volunteer portals where you can advertise roles and people can apply for them, but also so do, of course, I think pretty much every university in this country. And the brilliant thing about university is that people generally are applying for volunteer roles, either because it really complements their degree, but also because they might want to have something on their CV as they move forward into the world of work. And these tend to be people who are quite motivated, and as long as you're looking within the right degree courses, who have a fantastic skill set. And so for these, we're looking at people doing things like paramedic sciences, degrees around mental health support, they've got the skill set, and doing this kind of work is an asset to them. What we've also found is has been really helpful in terms of recruitment is using other less intensive projects for volunteers to grow their skills. I mentioned this is quite a challenging role. And so if people do come along who are unsure, what the partners are able to do is ask people if they'd like to, in the first instance, get involved in something like the food provision, where it's not about these intense relationships. And this just gives a bit of an understanding about what the client group, working with the client group, involves, what the role would involve, and it makes people feel more confident and capable to take on this bigger role. Finally, because I'm aware I'm almost running out of time, obviously keeping volunteers is important in any role, but particularly for these where we're depending on long-term relationships between the volunteer and the participant. The first thing, absolutely, with this kind of thing is prioritizing safety and support. When you're dealing one-on-one with people who might be sometimes chaotic or have complex needs, you have to show the volunteer that their safety is number one, and that is things like having the policies in place about what they do and don't do, but also providing on-course support. Personal relationships with the volunteers, know your volunteers and know who they're working with and what they're doing, so that when they come to you, you're able to offer that useful advice and guidance. Flexibility, this is a flexible role, so we need to be flexible in how we meet with their volunteers. Accepting that it isn't the role for everyone, I mentioned that previously. And then I think this is pretty routine, but having those regular trainings, meetings and support, because this is the role where people are working, you're not in a group, you're working one-on-one with a participant. We need to create that community and support for the volunteers. And sorry, Amy, I know I have gone over time, but that's it from me.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a really harsh task. Thank you. Really, really helpful things in there that I hope people can take away. So growing good, as I mentioned earlier, this webinar links to the growing good theme of participation. And Polly is here. Thank you, Polly, to tell us a little bit more about growing good now.
Great. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, as Amy said at the beginning, the Growing Good Toolkit is CUF's free 6-session course for churches that want to grow new connections in their community and make a difference. The first 5 sessions of the Growing Good Toolkit look at 5 different characteristics of church that have been identified by research in churches that are flourishing through their engagement in their community through social action. And these are presence, perseverance, hospitality, adaptability, and participation, which links very closely to the subject that we've been thinking about this morning. Each session of the Growing Good Toolkit includes reflection on scripture, a case study film, discussion, activity ideas, and prompts for prayer. And in the session on participation, we consider how participating in social action can be an entry point for people into the life of the church, and it can also be an opportunity for deepening faith and discipleship. There's an opportunity for the group to reflect on their own experiences of growing in faith and to look at what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we also consider where the church can encourage its members to join in with what's already going on in their local community, as well as inviting people to be part of what's going on within the church. So Julia and Jessica have provided us with some practical building blocks for working with volunteers, and Growing Good can help you to consider what it means to develop a culture of participation, where the church actively and intentionally sets out to create a culture where people are invited and enabled to participate in what is going on. So we would love you to have a look at the Growing Good Toolkit resources. It's free to sign up, and then you can access everything you need to run a session. And if you've used the resources already and want to share your feedback, we'd love to hear from you. So please do get in touch, or if you have any questions, or if you'd like a short conversation with me about the Growing Good Toolkit and how you could use it in your church, then again, please do get in touch with us. And we're now going to watch just a very, very short film, which gives you a taster of the Growing Good Toolkit resources.
We all want our churches to grow, to be places where people of all backgrounds can belong, contribute, and encounter Jesus, no matter where they are on their faith journey. And we all want communities of joy, justice, and right relationships where the work of the Holy Spirit is evident. But how do we make that happen?
The Growing Good Toolkit is designed to help churches connect the dots between social action, discipleship, and growth. Through flexible, interactive small group sessions, we will explore how our churches can be faithful and fruitful in our local communities. The Growing Good Toolkit is based on 3 years of research by Theos and Church Urban Fund. We've learned from over 60 churches, big and small, urban and rural, in areas of affluence and in low-income communities, and in everything in between.
As we journey through the toolkit, we will hear from Scripture, as well as research and stories from churches all across England. In our small groups, we'll learn from each other and consider what God might be calling us to do together. And we will pray, seeking God's wisdom and blessing.
God is at work transforming people and places. He's inviting us to be part of his story of transformation. Will you join us in Growing Good?
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Polly, for sharing that. Liz has just put a link to Growing Good, the website, in the chat. You can find out more, and I'll also send it around the email to everyone. So we're almost at the end of our time together. But before we dash off, I just wanted to let you know that we have recorded all of the webinars in this Growing Good series. So you can watch them back whenever it suits you, and you can share with other people in your church who might find them useful. They're just here at this link, past events link. Again, I'll send that around in the email so you can have them to watch whenever it suits you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up your time and coming along this morning. Really hope it's been helpful to you in some way. Thank you so much to Julia for your time this morning and all your brilliant insight. Thank you to Jessica for telling us about Wayfinder, and Polly for telling us about Growing Good. We will send you an email in the next few days with the links to the resources, Growing Good, recording of the session. But in the meantime, if there's anything that comes up, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Thank you for being here today. Bye, everyone.